May 3, 1945. 1437. Harburg, Lower Saxony, Germany. The sound came first. Boot leather on gravel. Measured. Deliberate. The 16 boys in the cellar pressed themselves against damp stone, their Hitler Youth daggers long since confiscated, their Panzerfausts empty, their illusions shattered. Outside, diesel engines idled. A British voice, clipped and calm, gave orders in a language most of them did not understand. One boy, Hans, 15, from Bremen, closed his eyes and whispered the Horst Wessel Lied under his breath, not from conviction but from habit, the way a drowning man might recite a childhood prayer. The door opened. Light flooded in. They braced for shouting, for blows, for the end. The first word they heard was, "Please." Then a sergeant stepped inside, holding not a rifle but a tin of corned beef and a stack of white bread rolls. Behind him, a medical orderly carried bandages and iodine. The boys stared. One began to cry. Another laughed, a sharp, hysterical bark that echoed off the walls. The sergeant set the tin on a crate, stepped back and said in broken German, "You eat. You rest. War is finish." They screamed at the knock, and wept over a cup of tea. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. The boys had not expected mercy. They had been taught otherwise. From the age of 10 they had been enrolled in the Deutsches Jungvolk, the junior wing of the Hitler Youth, where they learned to march, to salute, to throw grenades with the efficiency of trained soldiers. By 14 they graduated to the Hitlerjugend proper, where lectures on racial purity alternated with drills in rifle marksmanship and tactical field craft. The curriculum was clear. The Reich was eternal, the Führer infallible, death and service the highest honor. By early 1945, as the Red Army closed from the east and Allied bombers turned German cities into rubble, the youngest among them, some barely 12, were handed Panzerfausts and SS uniforms and sent to the crumbling front lines with half a day's training. They were not soldiers. They were children dressed as soldiers, fed into a machine that had run out of men. Hans and his group had been captured near Hamburg on April 28, during the final British assault on the city. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, once 20,000 strong, had been reduced to scattered remnants. Exhausted paratroopers, aging Volkssturm militiamen, firemen and police pressed into service, and boys like Hans who had been told they were defending civilization. They held Harburg for 2 days before British tanks arrived. The boys fired their Panzerfausts once, maybe twice, then threw down their weapons and ran. Some were shot. Some were captured. Hans hid in a cellar with 15 others, waiting for what they had been promised would come. Execution, torture, the brutal revenge of a vengeful enemy. The convoy moved north at dawn on May 4. 50 German POWs, mostly teenagers, packed into the backs of 2 Bedford trucks under canvas canopies that smelled of diesel and wet wool. The roads were cratered, the bridges blown, the countryside a patchwork of scorched farmland and abandoned vehicles. The boys sat in silence, hands clasped between their knees, watching the landscape roll past through gaps in the canvas. One boy, Otto, 16, from Hamburg, had a bandage wrapped around his left hand where shrapnel had torn through the flesh 2 days before. He stared at the bandage as if it were proof of something. Proof that he was still alive, proof that the British medic who had dressed it had been gentle, proof that the world had not ended after all. At noon the convoy stopped at a transit camp near Lüneburg. The camp had been hastily erected in an open field. Rows of white canvas tents, a perimeter of barbed wire, guard towers manned by British soldiers in khaki battle dress. The boys climbed down from the trucks, their legs stiff, their stomachs hollow. They expected a processing line, interrogations, perhaps beatings. Instead, they were led to a mess tent where camp stoves hissed with boiling water and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. A British cook, a balding man in his 40s with flour on his apron, ladled hot soup into tin bowls and handed them out without comment. The soup was thin but real, barley, carrots, potatoes, a hint of salt. Hans ate slowly, testing each spoonful as if it might be poisoned or taken away. It was not. After the meal, they were assigned to tents, 12 boys per tent, each with a canvas cot and a scratchy wool blanket stamped with the letters WD for War Department. The blankets were clean. The boys touched them cautiously, then pulled them around their shoulders and sat in silence, too exhausted to speak. The first real act of kindness came that evening. A British corporal, young, perhaps 22, walked between the tents distributing small parcels wrapped in brown paper. Each parcel contained a bar of chocolate, Cadbury's dairy milk, the wrapper printed in English, and a pack of cigarettes. Hans unwrapped his chocolate slowly, staring at the purple foil as if it were a relic from another life. He broke off a square and placed it on his tongue, letting it melt. The sweetness was overwhelming. He had not tasted chocolate in 2 years. Otto sat beside him, holding his cigarette pack unopened. "They are going to kill us tomorrow," he said quietly. "This is kindness before execution. Like a last meal." Hans shook his head. "If they wanted us dead, we would be dead already." Otto did not reply. He opened the cigarette pack, took one out, and lit it with a match the corporal had left behind. The smoke curled upward into the twilight, and for the first time in weeks, the boys allowed themselves to believe they might survive the night. "I thought they would beat us. Instead they gave us tea. I did not understand." Diary fragment, Anonymous Hitlerjugend POW, May 1945. The British Army's treatment of German POWs was not accidental. It was policy, deliberate, calculated, and rooted in a philosophy that had been hammered out in War Office memoranda as early as 1940. One such memo, stamped with the seal of the British government and circulated to camp commandants across the United Kingdom, read simply, "Prisoners are soldiers, not slaves. They will be treated accordingly." Those 6 words shaped every camp. The policy rested on 3 pillars. Security: POWs must be confined, disarmed, and prevented from returning to combat. Diplomacy: Britain had signed the 1929 Geneva Convention, and adherence to its terms would protect British soldiers held in German camps through the principle of reciprocity. Morality: Britain was fighting a war to preserve civilization, and civilization was not preserved by becoming what it opposed. This was not sentimentality. It was strategy. The British understood that humane treatment served a purpose. It undermined enemy morale, encouraged defections, and demonstrated to the world, and to the British public, that the Allies fought with honor. But it was also something else. It was restraint. In the face of Germany's atrocities, Britain chose not to respond in kind. It chose, instead, to be relentlessly, almost bureaucratically decent. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Reveille at 0600. Roll call. Breakfast, porridge, bread, weak tea. Work details: clearing rubble, repairing roads, sorting salvage, under the supervision of British guards who barked orders but did not strike. Lunch at midday. More work. Dinner at 1800. Lights out at 2200. For the boys, the routine was disorienting. They had been trained to expect chaos, brutality, the breakdown of order. Instead, they found order itself. The meals arrived on time. The guards were firm but fair. The latrines were dug properly and kept clean. There was no random violence, no midnight interrogations, no public humiliations. The British camp system operated with the mechanical precision of a bureaucracy that had processed millions of POWs over 2 world wars and had learned, through trial and error, how to manage captivity without cruelty. The food was not luxurious, but it was consistent. Each POW received approximately 2,500 calories per day, more than many German civilians were eating in the spring of 1945. The rations included bread, potatoes, cabbage, occasional meat, and tea. Red Cross parcels supplemented the diet with tins of condensed milk, biscuits, and chocolate. The boys, who had grown accustomed to hunger, ate everything. Some gained weight. Others simply stopped trembling. Hygiene was enforced. Showers were mandatory once a week, and the British provided soap, real soap, not the gritty ersatz bars they had used in Germany. Lice infestations were treated with delousing powder. Wounds were dressed by British medics who worked without comment, their hands swift and impersonal. One medic, a Welshman named Davies, cleaned Otto's infected hand, applied sulfa powder, and rebandaged it with fresh gauze. "You'll keep the hand?" he said in English. Otto did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was the tone of a doctor, not a conqueror. Hans was assigned to a work detail repairing a bombed-out railway bridge near the camp. The work was hard, lifting timbers, hauling stones, clearing debris, but it was work, not punishment. The British corporal in charge, a man named Fletcher, demonstrated each task patiently and expected the boys to follow. When Hans made a mistake, Fletcher corrected him without anger. When Hans worked well, Fletcher nodded. That was all. No praise, no punishment. Just work. One afternoon, Fletcher sat on a pile of rubble during a break and unwrapped a sandwich. He took a bite, then looked at Hans and the others who were sitting nearby and gestured to his haversack. "Help yourselves," he said in English, miming the act of eating. The boys hesitated. Fletcher shrugged and went back to his sandwich. After a moment, Hans reached into the haversack and pulled out a tin of sardines. He opened it, divided the contents among the group, and ate in silence. Fletcher said nothing. That evening Hans wrote in a scrap of paper he had found, "The British guard shared his food. He did not have to. I do not know what this means." Otto, lying on his cot, stared at the tent ceiling. "It means they are not what we were told," he said. "Then what are they?" Hans asked. Otto did not answer. The ideological shift came slowly, imperceptibly, like ice melting in spring. The boys had been raised on propaganda. The Allies were brutal, the British decadent and weak, the Americans mongrel savages, the Soviets subhuman Bolsheviks. Every lesson in the Hitlerjugend had reinforced this narrative. Every rally, every film, every speech had hammered it home. And yet, here they were, prisoners of the British, and none of it was true. The British did not rape. They did not torture. They did not starve. They were not monsters. They were men, ordinary men, who followed orders, did their jobs, and went home at the end of the day. One evening, a British sergeant named Whitaker sat on the steps of the mess tent, polishing his boots. Hans, passing by, stopped and stared. Whitaker looked up. "Yes, lad," he said. Hans pointed to the photograph tucked into the rim of Whitaker's helmet. A woman and two small children, smiling in a sunlit garden. "Your family?" Hans asked in broken English. Whitaker nodded. "My wife. My boys. 7 and 4. He smiled faintly. "Haven't seen them in 2 years. Hans nodded slowly. He thought of his own mother, whom he had not seen since February. He thought of his younger brother, who had been evacuated to the countryside. He thought of the photograph he no longer carried because it had been lost in the chaos of capture. "I have brother," he said. 9 years. Whitaker nodded. "Hope he's safe then." That was all. No speeches, no apologies, no grand gestures. Just two men briefly acknowledging the humanity in each other, then moving on. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more. The holiday came unexpectedly. On May 8th, word spread through the camp that Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The guards did not celebrate loudly, there were no cheers, no drunken revelries, but there was a palpable shift in the air. Relief. Exhaustion. A sense that the worst was over. That evening the camp commandant, a brigadier named Harcourt, ordered an extra ration of tea and biscuits for the POWs. It was a small gesture, but it was noted. The boys sat in their tents, eating their biscuits, and wondered what would happen next. A few days later, the British organized a football match, POWs against guards. The game was chaotic, the rules improvised, the ball a worn leather bladder that barely held air. The guards won, 3-1, but the boys laughed anyway. It was the first time they had laughed in months. Hans, watching from the sidelines, felt something shift inside him. He could not name it, but it was there. A loosening of the tight knot of fear and hatred that had defined his adolescence. The British were not his friends. They were his captors. But they were not his enemies either. They were something else, something he did not yet have words for. By late June, the camp had processed over 3,000 German POWs, most of them young, many of them children. The British released the youngest first, those under 16 deemed too young to have committed war crimes and too young to pose a threat. Hans and Otto were released on June 22 and sent to a repatriation center in Bremen. They were given civilian clothes, donated by British charities, and a train ticket home. Hans kept the Cadbury's wrapper in his pocket. The journey home took 2 days. The train crawled through the ruined landscape of northern Germany, past bombed-out cities and displaced persons camps, past columns of refugees trudging westward with their belongings on carts. Hans stared out the window, silent. Otto sat beside him, his bandaged hand resting on his knee. Neither spoke much. There was too much to say and no words adequate to the task. When Hans reached Bremen, he found his family's apartment building reduced to rubble. A neighbor directed him to a displaced persons camp on the outskirts of the city, where his mother and brother had been living in a tent since March. He found them. They wept. He did not. That night, lying on a canvas cot in the tent, Hans thought about the British camp. He thought about the chocolate, the bread, the medic who had treated his blistered feet without comment. He thought about Sergeant Whitaker and the photograph of his sons. He thought about the football match and the extra ration of biscuits on VE Day. He thought about all of it and he realized something he could not have articulated at 15. That mercy was not weakness, that restraint was not cowardice, that civilization was not a propaganda slogan but a practice. A choice made daily in small acts by ordinary people. By 1947, some 25,000 German POWs had chosen to remain in Britain voluntarily, working as laborers, farmhands, and tradesmen. They had been given the choice to return or to stay, and they had chosen to stay. Among them were former members of the Hitlerjugend who had been captured as boys and had grown into men in British custody. They had learned a language, a trade, and a different way of seeing the world. They wrote letters to their families in Germany, describing a country that was strange but not hostile, a people that were reserved but not cruel. They did not forget where they came from. But they did not return either. The photograph was taken in August 1945, in a camp near Manchester. It shows a group of German POWs playing cards in the shade of a tent, their uniforms faded, their expressions relaxed. One of them is laughing. The photograph was not propaganda. It was not staged. It was simply a moment when fear had given way to routine, and routine had given way to something almost like peace. If this story moved you, subscribe. There are more untold moments like this, waiting to be shared. Hans kept the Cadbury's wrapper for the rest of his life. He carried it in his wallet, folded carefully, a small purple square of foil that had once contained chocolate. When asked about it, he would unfold it, smooth it out on a table and say simply, "This was the first kindness I received after the war." He did not need to explain further. The war had taught him fear. The aftermath had taught him something else. Not forgiveness, that came later if it came at all, but recognition. The recognition that the enemy he had been taught to hate was not an enemy at all, but a mirror. That the boys in British uniforms were not so different from the boys in German uniforms. That the line between civilization and barbarism was not drawn between nations but within them, in the choices people made when no one was watching. The war had ended. The hunger had ended. The fear had ended. What remained was memory, and the small acts of decency that had punctuated the nightmare. A tin of corned beef. A cup of tea. A bandage applied by steady hands. A photograph of children in a sunlit garden. A football match on a muddy field. These were not grand gestures. They were not the stuff of monuments or speeches. But they were enough. They were, in the end, everything. The war had taught them fear. The peace taught them mercy.